Bueno, hola, buenas tardes para todas, para todos, para todes. Mi nombre es Diana Granados, soy de Colombia, de Fondo Lunaria, y en este momento vamos a empezar o vamos a dar inicio al panel sobre contexto. Hoy en la mañana hicimos un primer acercamiento en grupos sobre cómo veíamos actores, discursos, estrategias, antigénero, antidemocracia, antiderechos, y ahora en la tarde vamos a poderlo profundizar. Estoy muy contenta y espero que ustedes también, porque tenemos un panel privilegiado con tres personas que desde sus experiencias, desde su conocimiento, su trayectoria, nos van a brindar muchos elementos para poder profundizar en el contexto en el que nos estamos moviendo hoy en el mundo. Y también quería mencionar que en este panel iba a estar presente Mónica Roa. Mónica Roa es directora de la organización Puentes y Mónica también ha estado presente desde que iniciamos On the Right Track, desde que iniciamos en el camino correcto. Ella nos acompañó en un primer encuentro en Barcelona y desafortunadamente por temas de salud no va a poder estar hoy con nosotras y con nosotres, pero creo que bueno, en parte sus ideas van a estar también como circulando en el análisis que podamos hacer. Entonces quiero darle la bienvenida a Sonia Correa. Sonia es, bueno, mira, Sonia tiene muchas y muchos fans en este espacio. Entonces, Sonia, bienvenida. Y bueno, quería que te presentaras en un minuto.
¿Me presentar nada más? Sí. Bueno, buenas tardes. Yo voy a hablar en castellano. Yo soy Sonia Correa, yo soy brasileña y en Brasil, bueno, estoy en eso de ser feminista hace mucho, ¿no? En Facebook me ponen que soy de la empresa Feministas, ¿no? Y como ya saben, yo tendría edad para estar jubilada, pero esa no es una profesión de la cual una se jubila, ¿no? Entonces, por eso sigo acá con ustedes, ¿no? Y en esa, después de una larga trayectoria feminista desde hace 20 años, yo coordino con un compañero, Richard Parker, el Observatorio de Sexualidad y Política, que es un foro, un programa sediado en una ONG de las más antiguas de Brasil que trabaja con temas de SIDA, y el observatorio, que en inglés se llama Sexuality Policy Watch, se dedica desde muchos años a colectar información, procesar información y hacer análisis estratégicos sobre política sexual en general, ¿no? Y por eso, desde hace 5 años, inevitablemente empecé a estudiar políticas antigénero, porque estaban cambiando el escenario de las políticas sexuales de manera muy radical. Muchas gracias por estar acá.
Bueno, bienvenida, Sonia. Sonia también nos ha acompañado en otros espacios, así que un privilegio que sigamos contando con tu aporte. Y también tenemos a Gillian Kane. Gillian es directora de Global Policy and Research. Gillian, bienvenida, y también te doy la palabra para que te presentes, por favor.
Gracias. Hey, good afternoon. Very excited to be here and very grateful for the invitation. I'm Gillian Kane. I work at IPASS, which for folks who don't know, it's a NGO that works at the global level. We have about 16 offices and we are dedicated to access to abortion. And within that context, I work on policy and research. So a big part of my work for the last 16 years at IPASS has been looking at the anti-gender, anti-democracy movements, writing about it, sharing the information, and using it for advocacy. So this seems to be the perfect place to share that, but more importantly, to learn from everybody in the room. So I'm really looking forward to the dialogue. Thanks.
Okay. Bienvenida, Gillian, también a este panel. Y para cerrar, tenemos también a Alex. Alex es transactivista del colectivo Talas, de Belgrade. Y bueno, también nos va a hablar desde su contexto y desde esta tierra que nos ha recibido a todos y a todas hoy, sus reflexiones. Entonces, bienvenida y para que te presentes, por favor.
Thank you. My name is Alexa. You can call me Alex, it's easier. And I'm a trans activist from Belgrade. I'm a part of a local collective Talas Tirv, it means waves, and also part of a regional collective, Trans Network Balkan. And in this region we are working a lot of in trans feminist issues. It's very important for us, and we are dealing with anti-gender movements since we founded our organization, so thank you.
Bienvenido a este panel. Bueno, vamos a iniciar con una pregunta inicial, y es que queremos que tanto Sonia como Gillian como Alex nos cuenten qué sabemos en este momento de eso que llamamos movimientos antigénero, antidemocracia, o de esas fuerzas políticas de extrema derecha que sabemos hoy y que nos falta también por saber, y que una y cada uno lo pueda responder desde su propio contexto. Yo les voy a mostrar este cartelito cuando más o menos queden 2 minutos. Cada intervención va a tener 8 minutos. Para que podamos avanzar con la siguiente ronda de preguntas. Y después de 2 rondas de preguntas, vamos a abrir el espacio para recibir sus inquietudes y sus preguntas. Así que por favor tomen nota o tengan también en mente lo que ustedes quieran ahora preguntar. Entonces, adelante, Sonia.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Diana. Antes de responder la pregunta, quiero también hacer un agradecimiento que debería haber hecho antes, pero quiero hacerlo. Que es agradecer mucho a los fondos por la invitación, por estar con ustedes hoy, por muchas razones, pero también porque, como ya saben algunas, ¿no? Georgia y Andrea incluso, yo he estado en Yugoslavia hace 50 años. Yo crucé el país en coche en el año de 1973. Y entonces estar acá de nuevo es una emoción muy grande, porque es como devolverme a mi juventud, ¿no? Entonces, muchísimas gracias por esa memoria, ¿no? Y quiero también agradecer mucho el ejercicio que hemos hecho colectivamente en la mañana, porque he traído un montón de elementos de información, de análisis, de percepciones, que seguramente no es nuestra intención procesar eso, pero estoy segura que va a tener resonancias con lo que vamos a decir, ¿no? Y quizás observar que uno de los puntos que apareció en la mañana, que creo que es muy importante, es el tema de las condiciones sistémicas que favorecen al surgimiento, crecimiento y llegada al poder de la ultraderecha y de los actores e ideologías antigénero. Ese es un tema muy importante y creo que quizás tendremos que mirarlo más adelante. No va a ser posible tratar de él ahora, pero quiero dejarlo como en el parking lot, porque creo que es un tema crucial. Hablando más bien de actores y modos de funcionar de las políticas antigénero, yo creo que la primera cosa que sabemos es que hoy nos enfrentamos con fuerzas muy poderosas y ágiles y con procesos políticos muy complejos y muy amplios, ¿no? Para describirnos eso necesitamos de base empírica sólida, pero también de lentes de lectura siempre renovadas. Y estoy mirando a Sandra porque hablamos de eso en el break. Eso porque muchas de las cosas que pasan hoy se parecen con cosas que conocíamos del pasado, tiene muchos sesgos comunes, los mismos actores, pero no es más de lo mismo, ¿no? Y muchas veces usamos lentes de antes para leer lo que está pasando ahora y eso no funciona, ¿no? Yo tengo dicho desde hace mucho que las políticas antigénero son micropolíticas porque afectan la vida cotidiana de la gente, ¿no? Son macropolíticas porque involucran las dinámicas de los estados nacionales y actores estatales y procesos estatales, procesos parlamentarios, judiciales, etc. No, pero también son geopolíticas, ¿no? Hay un juego geopolítico de género que tenemos que tener en cuenta. Una segunda cosa que sabemos es que las políticas antigénero, aun cuando se hayan hecho visibles, muy visibles, ¿no?, los últimos 10 años, ¿no?, empezando a un solo tiempo en Europa y América Latina, creo que eso es muy importante, no es que empezó Europa y se fue a América Latina, empezó acá en América Latina en 2013, 2014, y solo en Estados Unidos solo llegó después, aun cuando Estados Unidos estuviera exportando ideas, ¿no? Aun cuando sea reciente, su historia es mucho más larga y compleja, ¿no?, su genealogía. Yo veo las políticas antigénero como un capítulo reciente de una larga y complicada trayectoria de reorganización de la ultraderecha en las Américas y en Europa, ¿no? Y esa reorganización implicó un cambio radical del modo político de accionar de la ultraderecha, pasando de una posición de defensa del orden, eso que llamamos reaccionario o reaccionarismo, para una posición de accionar fuerzas políticas para luchar por la hegemonía cultural y política. Eso que nosotros en el campo de estudios llamamos el giro gramsciano de la derecha, el Gramscian turn of the right, ¿no? Eso lo decíamos hace 5 años, nadie nos escuchaba. Pero ahora los actores de la ultraderecha lo están diciendo ellos mismos. Entonces ni necesitamos teorizar. Milei lo ha dicho, Agustín Laje lo ha dicho, Frank Furedi lo ha dicho el otro día. Entonces ya es como dato de la realidad, ¿no? Tercero, las políticas antigénero, ellas mismas, son muy antiguas también, ¿no? Sus orígenes pueden ser datados de los textos del cardenal Ratzinger en los años 1980, ¿no? Después tuvimos esa explosión, ¿no?, esa erupción pública política de la fantasmagoría de género, o sea, que llamo el problema del género del Vaticano, en 1995, en las Naciones Unidas, en el pasaje de la conferencia del Cairo para Beijing, ¿no? Una otra cosa, ¿no?, que es muy importante decir es que después de ese momento de explosión, que fue el ataque del Vaticano con otros actores a género en Beijing, hubo un proceso largo de maturación, ¿no?, de maturación intelectual, de discursos teológicos, posiciones teológicas, pero también de traducción de la crítica al género, de la producción de un fantasma de género, del género, como dice Judith Butler, para traducción popular, o sea, para hablar al senso común. Y creo que es muy importante decir que desde los años 90, en esa traducción popular, género está siempre asociado a marxismo, ¿no? Género como la otra cara del marxismo, las feministas de género como siendo una nueva versión del marxismo, ¿no? Y digo eso porque Javier Milei lo ha dicho en Davos hace un mes, y no es una novedad, ¿no? Esto están diciendo hace 30 años, ¿no? La tercera cosa, bueno, y ahí otra cosa a subrayar es que las políticas antigénero tienen muchos blancos: el feminismo, los derechos LGBT, el aborto, la educación sexual, muchas cosas. Pero su objetivo primero y principal es descalificar la teoría crítica de género. Y eso no podemos perder de vista. O sea, no es una política contra las mujeres, ¿no? Es una política contra la teoría de género y sus implicaciones más amplias, ¿no? El tercer punto es que las formaciones que impulsan las políticas de género son heterogéneas, son metamórficas, son adaptables a los contextos, ¿no? Aun cuando generada por el Vaticano, ¿no?, la ideología antigénero, como dice mi amigo David Paternot, es como Frankenstein, ¿no? Una criatura que se huyó del laboratorio, ¿no?, y ganó vida propia, ¿no? Ahora ya no es solamente accionada por el Vaticano, por la Iglesia Católica, es accionada por un conjunto muy complicado de actores y fuerzas, lo que hace muy corto si decimos que política de antigénero solo tiene que ver con fundamentalismos, ¿no? Tiene que ver, tiene una relación, pero no eso es mucho más, ¿no? Además, su modo de, su morfología, ¿no? Su forma, es muy compleja. Yo tengo dicho y escrito que las políticas antigénero son como hidras, ¿no? Ese animal muy antiguo, pero que sobrevive en los imaginarios sociales, ¿no? Un animal que tiene muchas cabezas, la cabeza se mueve en muchas direcciones. Eso hace difícil de saber cómo son, dónde son, para dónde van. Y también beben en corrientes ideológicas muy distintas, ¿no? Y en ese mismo registro, yo pienso que tenemos que pensar las políticas antigénero como creando, no es solamente la relación entre actores, instituciones, los discursos que hacen, es como un ecosistema, ¿no? Hay un ecosistema de la política antigénero que es parte del ecosistema mayor de la ultraderecha, ¿no? Y es eso que nos va a permitir comprender por qué, por más paradojal que pueda parecer, en ese ambiente están las fuerzas de extrema derecha, fuerzas postfascistas, fuerzas religiosas, pero también seculares, pero también gente de izquierda, voces de izquierda que están adheridas a los discursos antigénero. Un ejemplo, el expresidente Rafael Correa, que en América Latina anunció las campañas antigénero en 2013, ¿no? O sea, desde el comienzo. Ahora tenemos más complejidades, ¿no? Grupos LGB de derecha que manejan proposiciones antigénero. Y para ese conjunto acá, aún más desafiante, el tema de los feminismos, de las corrientes feministas antigénero, esencialistas, que son parte de esa misma ecología y que están intercambiando repertorios, ideas y teniendo relaciones orgánicas políticas concretas con la ultraderecha, como tenemos documentado en España, en Estados Unidos, en Reino Unido, en Brasil, ¿no? Para terminar, pero no menos importante, yo pienso que al leer las políticas antigénero hoy por hoy, distinto de lo que pasaba hace 10 años, es fundamental saber diferenciar las políticas antigénero que son dinámicas de movilización política. Por ejemplo, ¿qué pasó con Manif pour Tout en Francia? El ataque al matrimonio igualitario en Croacia en 2013, los ataques a género en educación por toda parte en el mundo, porque están en África, están en América Latina, están incluso en India. Son movilizaciones. Diferenciar eso de los lugares donde la ideología antigénero ya se ha convertido en política de Estado. O sea, es parte de la gramática de Estado, como en Hungría, como en Rusia, como ha pasado en Brasil con Bolsonaro, como está pasando ahora con Milei en Argentina, varios estados norteamericanos, varios gobiernos locales de España, ¿no? Y para terminar, un minutito, ¿no? Es fundamental comprender que esos son diferentes. Incluso también es diferente políticas antigénero que llevan un presidente, un líder de ultraderecha al poder, como es el caso de Bolsonaro o Milei o Meloni, de otras situaciones como Putin o como Guatemala, donde son líderes autocráticos que absorben la ideología de género y la instrumentalizan. O sea, hacer esas diferenciaciones, a mi ver, es muy importante. ¿Qué es que no sabemos? Sabemos muy poco sobre la infraestructura económica, financiera de esas fuerzas. Y no es solo financiación que pasa de un lado por otro, cómo las élites económicas del mundo están financiando eso. Casi la economía política, ¿no? De la ultraderecha. Y sobre todo, no sabemos aún bien cómo y por qué los discursos, los argumentos, los afectos movilizados por esas fuerzas están produciendo electorados ultraconservadores y de ultraderecha en todo el mundo. Eso es como una laguna gigante de investigación que tenemos que mencionar todas las veces que hablamos del tema. Disculpe por el tiempo, Diana.
Muchas gracias.
Is this okay? Yeah. Well, thank you, Sonia, for setting the stage in a really clear and detailed way. So it's a really big question, obviously. What do we know? Books have been written about it, articles. So this is all good. We know a lot. To Sonia's point, there's stuff we still don't know. We don't know finances, but we know a lot. And I guess my hope is that with these 3 days and these conversations to use this information for advocacy. So I want to start out by telling a little story. Today starts the Commission on the Status of Women. So just sort of interested, who here has been or follows the events at CSW? Okay, so not that many. So for those who don't follow it, CSW, and Sonia again referenced this, started in 1999, and in a lot of ways we can pinpoint that as a really important nexus for the opposition coming together and acting and responding. So this was a moment where reproductive rights were identified and supported in a really concrete way at the global level. And then almost immediately there was the pushback. So that's just to give context for what happened over the weekend. So CSW takes place over 2 weeks. It's in New York City. This year, more than ever, I think it's like 5,000 feminist women are descending. This is our place, or should be our place for activism and for moving forward. And it's not. It's become this place where our issues are really entrenched because we're always battling. We're battling over language, over commas and sentences, over words. But what was very interesting is that these are also opportunities for us. And so we found out a couple of days ago that there's an event happening probably right now at the UN that is being hosted by UN Women. And it's also being co-hosted by the IOC, which is the Islamic Organization of Islamic Conferences, which is a network that brings together 54 Islamic countries. Also speaking at this event is an American woman, and her name is Sharon Slater. And she runs this small organization under $1 million a year called Family Watch International. So this small organization, which is run by Sharon, who is a Mormon, so that's an interesting observation. Oh, this is slow for me. Okay, I'm trying so hard to be slow. Okay, I will pause. There's so much to say. Anyway, Sharon's there, right? She's a bad person. She's like, wherever you go, like, smoke follows her. And again, she's interesting because she presents herself as a grandmother, a concerned grandmother. So what is a concerned grandmother doing speaking with the IOC, with UN Women? And she's talking about family. But we know she's a bad person because we've followed her for years. And I'll give some more detail as to why she's been a real barrier for us to move our issues forward. But enough to say that there's reams of evidence, articles about her. So we, the feminist collective who work in these spaces, we wrote letters to UN Women. This is in the last 48 hours saying, hey, we see that you're sharing the stage with this person who's really bad. Can you either get her off of the agenda or get UN Women off of the agenda, because the two of you shouldn't be sitting at the same table. And the response we got from UN Women was no, and we think it's important to share the stage with other people and have other voices, and we're going to counter her voice. So that was a very unacceptable response for us, because we do this research and we want to activate it, and we want to stop the anti-gender, anti-rights movements where we can, and to be really vocal. And to Sonia's point also about where do you find opposition, we found opposition within a supposed ally. So I raised this point to show sort of the challenge that we have in our work to respond, because there's so many different weaknesses and points of dispute, I guess, that make our work hard. So that's sort of the setting. I wanted to just say, like, look, there are all these different places, but I'm going to return to Sharon Slater. So Sharon is a Mormon, which is, for those who don't know, Mormonism is not considered Christian by some other faiths. They define as Christian. So this is an interesting point because they operate spaces that are primarily dominated by Christians, Catholics, and evangelicals. Anyway, she's there, and wherever she goes, as I said, this dust of I don't want to say evil. That's too strong a word. But she is present, and she makes connections at the UN level, because she's active there all the time, and then she goes to the country level, and she activates her work there. So we know that she's been active in Uganda. And last year in Uganda, there was an interparliamentary forum in Entebbe that was brought together parliamentarians from all across the region. And she was a key person there, both organizing it, but also participating. And after she left, after this event, Uganda signed one of the most restrictive anti-LGBT laws into law. Museveni signed it. So again, here's this woman with a very small organization mobilizing people in Uganda. And then after that, the bill passes. The same thing happened in 2019. Sharon Slater went to Ghana, to Accra, Ghana, where she was participating in the World Congress of Families there. She was present at a parliamentary prayer breakfast, so she met with a lot of heads of government as well as religious leaders. And then a few months later, there's a proposed anti-LGBT bill as well there. And so then after that, as we know, it took a couple of years, but a few weeks ago, the Ghanaian parliament signed this bill into law. They signed the bill. It's still waiting for the president's signature. So we talk a lot about the U.S. influence, and not to overstate it, obviously the U.S. does have a big footprint, but they also rely very much on opposition forces in country. So there's a lot of synergy that takes place. So I think it's important to also note that the relationships that build are synergistic, but they're also, if Sharon didn't show up, I asked people in Uganda, would the bill still pass? They said no. But I do think, that's important, but I also think that, they were building on a movement there, on an appetite to use the anti-LGBT movement for political purposes. And I want to move back to today as well and talk about what's coming in the next few months. So the 2024 has been declared the year of elections. There is so much possibility for regression and also progress. Still too, oh my gosh. I don't know how to do that. So hard. Okay. Okay. So I want to talk about three things really quickly, again, that we can anticipate going forward. And this is going to be a focus on the US. So again, forgive for that US centrism, but I do think we can't ignore the fact of the potency of the United States, even though the hegemony is hopefully diffusing a little bit. But again, talking about this is the year of the elections, and it's not just the US, but I'm going to focus on that now. Last year, there's a right-wing foundation, think tank, called the Heritage Foundation. And they released basically their blueprint for what they're going to do if and when Trump wins the election in November. It's 900 pages long, and it's a very scary read. And it's an important read because it addresses every aspect of government. And in some ways, what they're advertising has already taken place in Argentina. For example, 2 minutes? Okay. Milei, is getting rid of the Department of Education, Ministry of Education. So it's really trying to eviscerate the what they call the administrative state. But one thing I want to focus on is that, in my opinion, I think Trump will win. But if Trump doesn't win, the danger is already there. Because so many of the pieces that are advertised in this Project 25 is the name of the manifesto, are already taking place. And in 1 minute, I'm going to give a really quick example. Actually, I'm not going to save it for later. But just to say that I think as a community, we need to raise awareness about what they're forecasting. They're literally saying, here is our map, and we need to be prepared to respond. And I think for the global level, what's interesting and what they advertise in this book is they're going to defund multilateralism. And specifically, they're going to go after the WHO, they're going to go after UNICEF, and UNFPA. And so that already happened in the Trump administration, but they're going to go further. And again, all of these things will take place whether or not Trump wins. If Trump wins, the danger is magnified. So not to end on a depressing note, and I know we're going to have opportunities in the conversation to really consider how to respond, but I think having an awareness is empowerment and shouldn't leave us defeated. So looking forward to thinking about how to move that forward in the chat. And sorry for talking so fast. I will do it slower next time. Oh,
Okay, I will talk a bit about anti-gender actors here in Serbia, main actors, and a bit about them in a region, because it's all connected, of course. I think that for all our countries here, and we agreed on that in a previous discussion with groups, that the governments are the biggest actor in every country. And in Serbia, the main supporter of that actor is Serbian Orthodox Church, and they are very influential, and they are really they were always toxic, but now they are especially toxic in the past few years. So the government and the church here are very connected. For example, of course, we are a democracy, but we have a dictator here, and everybody knows that, and he is admitting that, I think, in every day on the media. And we have all the media are in control of government. We have a few independent media, and that rhetoric, which is of course anti-gender, is spread through the media. We are happy that our internet is free for now. I hope that this will stay the same, and we can share information through internet, through social networks, but the media is influencing the thinking of whole population here in Serbia. So those actors are very strong here, church and government. And for example, when church propose something in public, on some public prayer, I don't know how to call it in English, it's we call it moleban, but they call it public prayer. When they preach something against, for example, LGBT rights, in the next month, governmental institutions provide that through laws or through some acts or through some, for example, I will mention a case of textbooks from biology. It is textbooks for 8th grade elementary school. Those textbooks contained for the first time explanation of why March of 8 is important, about some paragraph about Clara Zetkin, paragraph about what it means to be a homosexual, what it means to be a transgender, and what it means to be intersexual person. And that textbooks lasted for 1 year, and before Europride, which was held in 2022 here in Belgrade, church was really mad because of that pride, and they decided to have that public prayer 1 month before Pride. And they, of course, condemned the LGBT population, and they actually asked the state to remove all those paragraphs about homosexuality, about transgender issues, about feminist issues from that textbooks. And they, of course, said it on in front of one big church here in Belgrade, and in the next months that was done. Minister for Education did that like out of any order, any procedure, legal procedure for removing something from textbooks. They have a few people, like kind of board. They formed a board of people who will be, judging if it is an appropriate context for text for kids or not. And of course that board decided that it is not appropriate text for kids to read in schools, and of course they tried to hide that information about who are in that board. And one independent media of course find out at the end that the members of that board were very famous homophobes and transphobes and persons from our public discourse. It was a professor from sociology department, from politicology, and people who are well known as promoters of anti-gender rights here for decades. So we have also that kind of intellectuals here as very important anti-gender actors, because they are their jokers for any action they need. They will put their signature because they are like faculty professors, academics, and they will support that anti-gender actions they like want to have here. So also the important actors, especially from trans community here, are groups that are like formed maybe 5 years ago. It's so-called feminist groups, but they are not, they are transphobic, and they are actively work on promoting anti-trans rhetorics and anti-trans narratives here. Some of them are part of leftist organizations, also so-called leftists. They are anti-trans also. They are also part of LGB organizations without T, and they are focused a lot on trans kids, but not so much as in Croatia, which is interesting because in this region, usually when we have something in Croatia, we need to wait for two years, and we have it the same thing in Serbia. And it's funny because Serbian Orthodox Church is a big hater of Catholic Church, and they are always telling our people that we are importing that transgender people and the LGBT agenda from the West. But actually they imported anti-gender rhetorics and narratives from the West. They like write it down, it's verbatim from the first to the last word. So it's the same sentences actually they are talking to our people. Like you can hear that, I hear that from all of you when we are talking about anti-gender movement. So they have, it's very dangerous, I think, because 10 years ago, of course, trans community here is very old. We exist like, yes, but 10 years ago, nobody cares about that because we were invisible. And now, since 2015, when we have first Trans Pride March here in Belgrade, we became visible. And the more we are visible, the more we will suffer from transphobia. And at first, I was really scared that anti-gender narratives will be, harming our rights, but nobody believed it because up until 10 years ago, nobody cared about trans rights, and it looks like in public that things will be good for us because they brought a law that the state is paying part of your medical transition, and they brought a law that you can legally change your name, and etc., etc. But then the anti-gender and transphobic groups started to, making their statements publicly and pushing it a lot in public, and then a lot of people from academia and from activism and from feminism were confused at first and didn't know what to think. A lot of them agreed with the transphobic discourses and narratives, and then it's very, very hard to, change their mind now when but some of them actually change their mind, hopefully. So I think that the most important actors is government, church, academics, and that activist groups who are transphobic. So thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias por esta primera aproximación a qué sabemos que nos falta y cómo estamos viendo desde contextos diferentes este mismo proyecto político, ¿no? Ahora, bueno, nosotras y nosotres estamos aquí, activistas de América Latina, activistas de Europa, porque sabemos del poder que nos da juntarnos, ¿no? Del poder que nos da conectarnos. Y también sabemos que estas fuerzas políticas conservadoras, antigénero, antidemocracia, también se conectan y se juntan. Entonces nos gustaría un poco que ustedes nos aportaran sobre cómo funcionan y cómo son esas conexiones. En el ejercicio de la mañana vimos cosas parecidas en los carteles, ¿no? Nombres como Citizen Go, vimos ataques a niñas y niñas trans, vimos ataques a la educación sexual, como que hay conexiones. Entonces nos gustaría en esta segunda ronda que nos hablaran un poco sobre las conexiones. ¿Quién quiere empezar?
Bueno, yo creo que el primer aspecto con relación a las conexiones ya apareció sea en el ejercicio de la mañana como en la conversación ahora, ¿no? Una buena parte de las fuerzas de ultraderecha y que son antigénero y son antiabortos son fuerzas transnacionales, ¿no? La Iglesia son fuerzas transnacionales, ¿sí? La Iglesia Católica es probablemente la institución transnacional más antigua del mundo. No accidentalmente se explotó en las Naciones Unidas, que es un lugar transnacional por excelencia. Las otras iglesias son también transnacionales, no son tan centralizadas, pero también transitan de un lugar a otro. Los evangélicos. Hay iglesias evangélicas surgidas en Brasil que están hoy por toda América Latina, por China y por África. O sea, son actores transnacionales por excelencia. Son transnacionales esas figuras como Sharon Slater y sus organizaciones y esas redes antiguas o nuevas, ¿no? Que sea la organización de Sharon Slater o ahora Citizen Go, por ejemplo, PNV, que son organizaciones, son todos transnacionales, ¿no? Y eso significa que cuando hacemos análisis de contexto nacional es siempre importante tener eso en cuenta, ¿no? Para usar de nuevo una metáfora de animal mítico. Yo decía que las formaciones de antigénero son como hidras, pero yo creo que son como quimeras también, ¿no? Esos animales de cuerpo doble o triple, porque una parte de sus cuerpos está muy asentada en los niveles locales, ¿no? Grupos religiosos locales, comunidades locales, los electores que votan por la derecha. Pero hay una otra parte del cuerpo que somos esos tentáculos, ¿no? Que van por el mundo afuera, que hacen conexiones, por donde transitan repertorios, estrategias políticas, incluso proposiciones legislativas, ¿no? Que pasan de un lugar para otro ahora en cuestión de meses, ¿no? Entonces creo que esa es la primera. Eso es que explica por qué esas políticas de abajo arriba contra género han erupcionado a un solo tiempo en América Latina y Europa, ¿no? No fue secuencial, ¿no? Eso explica por qué hay tantos ataques a género y sexualidad y en educación por todos los lados, porque eso es compartido por toda la gente, ¿no? O más recién, como decía Alex, ¿no? El momento ahora es de la furia contra los derechos trans, ¿no? Eso se está replicando como un código ideológico por todas las partes, ¿no? Empieza en un lugar y 3 meses después está en otro, con sobre todo ese foco en la protección de la niñez, ¿no? El tema de la niñez trans como una monstruosidad, ¿no? Bueno, eso nos pone un reto, ¿no? Es, a mi ver, que es que esa naturaleza transnacional es inequívoca. Nuestro reto principal ahora es saber cómo eso se manifiesta en cada contexto, porque aunque hay esas conexiones transnacionales, hay muchas diferencias de contexto para contexto y tenemos que mapear eso con mucho más atención. Pienso que el ejercicio que empezamos a hacer hoy de mañana puede ser muy útil para comprender cómo se traduce eso en cada lugar, porque no es lo mismo en toda parte, ¿no? El segundo reto es que pienso que es bien urgente que conceptualicemos mejor las conexiones entre política antigénero y racismo. Y racismo. Porque hay manifestaciones que son parecidas, mas al mismo tiempo diferentes, ¿no? La manera como eso se articula en Europa, que hay una conexión muy directa entre la ultraderecha, políticas antigénero, posiciones anti-inmigración que son racistas. Giorgia Meloni es como el ícono de eso, no es la única, pero es como icónica. En Estados Unidos es eso, pero no es exactamente eso, porque el racismo, el supremacismo blanco tiene una historia mucho más profunda relacionada a la esclavitud. Hay una conexión entre atacar género y teoría crítica racial, pero hay más confusiones y ambigüedades con migrantes, porque es antimigrante, pero también queremos los electores migrantes, o sea, y en América Latina de nuevo tenemos complicaciones porque nuestro racismo muy profundo, anclado en el legado de la esclavitud, pero también tenemos eso de que nuestras nacionalidades han sido construidas sobre los mitos de mestizaje, ¿no? El mito de democracia racial, que de algún modo también fue absorbido por fuerzas conservadoras, ¿no? Y además, en el caso de América Latina, no sé cómo se aplica a Estados Unidos, tenemos el reto de que muchas de las comunidades religiosas, sobre todo evangélicas, que son hoy parte de esa parte del cuerpo asentado local, ¿no? De las políticas antigénero, son comunidades negras, son poblaciones negras y son poblaciones indígenas también en muchos casos. Entonces eso crea una tensión y una paradoja, y eso hemos trabajado muy poco y tenemos que enfrentarlo, ¿no? Y finalmente, pero no menos importante, yo pienso que en ese marco de las conexiones transnacionales, yo creo que en esa sala las feministas, las personas trans, el transfeminismo, estamos desafiados a retomar con mucho vigor una cuestión muy antigua, no es nada nueva, ella tiene por lo menos 30 años o más, ¿no? Que es la pregunta sobre la categoría mujer como único principio organizador del feminismo, ¿no? Y creo que eso es absolutamente vital hoy, no solamente por el tema de los feminismos transfóbicos, que están como que adentro, ¿no? Están en la ecología de la ultraderecha, pero también acá cerca de nosotros, pero también porque esas fuerzas de que estamos hablando, que están por el mundo todo, que transitan, que son transnacionales, están llenas de mujeres, ¿no? El tema de las mujeres no es casual que Gillian ha traído acá un problema de Sharon Slater en un panel de ONU Mujer, ¿no? Que, o sea, hay una normalización, porque es mujer, está en un panel de ONU Mujer, como estaba Kathleen Novak en una mega conferencia en Kigali, en Uganda, ¿no? Una voz de la ultraderecha. Entonces, yo creo que, y como ven, es transnacionalizado, ¿no? No es un fenómeno de mujeres de base religiosas que hacen parte de esas formaciones. Esas mujeres son hoy como champions y están por todo lado súper conectadas, ¿no? Estoy hablando acá de las mujeres de derecha, ¿no? Las líderes de la ultraderecha, que creo que es un tema que tenemos que enfrentar.
Turning them all off. No. Sí, está bien. Okay. I'm going to pick up on, I'm going to speak very slow, and I'm going to pick up on a few things both that Alex mentioned and Sonia as well. And, you know, it's this idea of contagion, right? So Alex was saying that the contagion can happen over 2 years, and it's across border. And then Sonia picked up some themes about the transnational, which I want to elevate as well, and kind of stick to the theme of invasion in our spaces as well. So with the example that Sonia gave of Kathleen Novak, no friend of ours, who had a prominent space last year at a feminist conference, you know, with this year with, or today with Sharon Slater. But the example I want to give is one that's quite interesting that highlights, again, the US, as sort of, you know, the fountain of a lot of ideas and the export of that. So one project that recently has come out is started by this woman, again, another woman, who is really using this feminist framing in some ways to push an anti-feminist agenda. And we can actually date this to a couple of years ago during the Trump administration when they started this anti-abortion initiative, we'll call it, where they had 36 countries sign the Geneva Consensus Declaration. Just a quick show of hands, does everybody know what this is? The Geneva Consensus Declaration? Okay. So not most. So very quickly, this was in 2020, right before the US elections. And there was this woman, Valerie Huber, who was in the Trump administration, who decided to put together a coalition of countries to sign basically a manifesto. It doesn't have political weight. There's no accountability. There's no, you don't watch it, but it's a political statement. And it was signed by 36 countries, most of them who are authoritarian and certainly are not pro-women. And the manifesto has 4 points, but the major one was it's anti-abortion, anti-LGBT issues, pro-sovereignty, national sovereignty, which was quite interesting. Anyway, that happened. Trump loses the election. And then Valerie Huber goes and she starts a new organization, which she calls the Institute for Women's Health. So the name is actually very close to an organization that Angeles and I used to work on, which was the International Women's Health Coalition. No accident, I'm sure. And Valerie Huber is saying, I'm doing this project because I'm going to attend to women's needs in their all their holistic needs, right? And this is very much reproductive justice framework as well, minus the racial component. So she's going and she shops this around, and she creates like a health and rights model called Protego, which she launches this year. And again, using the framing of health, rights, women-centered, women's needs, their spiritual, their emotional needs. And she says very explicitly, this is to operationalize the Geneva Consensus Declaration. So as I mentioned, the GCD, it has no implementation power. But this, and again, it's hard to describe because she hasn't released sort of the details of it, but it's very vague, it's very nice language. Anyway, she travels to Guatemala over the last year and develops a very close relationship with the president Giammattei, who they stand side by side and they sign these commitments, and Guatemala becomes the pilot location for this Protego project. And one of the things that Protego says is that it's going to outlast any administration, and it's very important that they include that because it was launched right before the elections in Guatemala, which Giammattei lost, and he lost to a progressive. But Protego still stays there. And one of the things that they said, and they had a very spicy launch, lots of people, lots of public notice, was that they had started it and they had educated 3 million children in Guatemala on what we don't know. But given Huber's background, we know it's probably anti-LGBT and it's anti-abortion. Anyway, fast forward to 2 weeks ago, Valerie Huber travels to Uganda, and she's in this huge meeting with Janet Museveni, who is the First Lady. She's also the Minister of Sports and Education in Uganda. And they decide that, and they announce they're formally launching a partnership between the government of Uganda and the Institute for Women's Health. And by the way, Institute for Women's Health is about 1.5 years old. So I mention all of this because going back, Project 2025, if you go through this 900-page document as I did, there's many references to the Geneva Consensus Declaration. And one of the things they say is that when the new administration comes in, they're going to make sure that any Biden policies that don't align with the Geneva Consensus Declaration will be removed. The other thing is that obviously they don't mention Protego, but if the administration comes in, what they're going to do, as we've already seen, and they're forecasting for us, is to start having partnerships with different governments where they're going to implement an educational and health model. And the one thing I didn't mention is that the partnership is with the Ministries of Health and the Ministries of Education. So I'm going to stop here, but I think this is a sufficient example to really show both the tentacles reaching into the Africa region, the Latin America region. It comes from the US, it comes with funding, and I think it's something that we need to be aware of and watch out for, again, if or not Trump wins, because it's already happening. And one of the things that we're working with feminists in Guatemala, and I'd like to hear if there's any Guatemalans here, is what does it mean now that the administration has changed and there's a new progressive in Guatemala? Will they still move this forward? Because again, they had a formal agreement with the Ministry of Education. So happy to talk more about that, but I think it really, like I said, illuminates the challenges, the entrenchment, and the transnational connections that continue being made.
Okay. In Serbia, actually, our government are, as everybody calls it, they say sit on two chairs. One chair is for we are going to Europe, and with the other chair we are going with Russia. So when some of the officials or our president visits Europe, usually after he came back in Serbia, he started to speak publicly about our connection, how our connections to Russia are important, and that the Russia is our, I don't know, mother and whatever. So the Russian influence here is very strong. And of course connected to anti-gender movements, and we from activists we are thinking that maybe money and support for anti-gender actors is coming from Russia. We are not sure, but we are thinking like maybe this is the where money came from. And it is interesting, for example, I mentioned earlier what happens in Croatia, later happens here. But for example, in Croatia, we have anti-trans attacks on kids, and a lot of doctors are spreading that anti-trans narratives. Here in Serbia, doctors are quiet about that. But why? Because in Serbia we have I think maybe a very famous in the world clinic for medical transition. And there are one team of doctors. Of course, everything is centralized here in Belgrade and monopolized by them. They are not good people. And those people are really well connected with the government. And they are, of course, part of the ruling party and everything. And I think this is, for example, this is their territory, and nobody dares to speak from their profession. Nobody dares to speak about trans issues publicly, because this is their issue actually to speak in their territory. So you can see on that example, and in Croatia, it's not the thing. They have doctors who are against trans kids. So you can see that how that influence is made through money always, and through some other, of course, influence. Those doctors in Belgrade, they are making money on doing medical transition, not only for our citizens, but from other people from other countries who came to Serbia. The whole region is coming to Serbia to do surgical procedures and medical transition. So they are have that territory, and they are in charge of this. So the other actors, I'm not sure about, of course, church and the government are very well connected. They are like acting as some kind of mafia, actually, both of those institutions. And we have, of course, right-wingers. They are not officially in the government, and they are acting like an opposition, but most of them, like 99% of them, are also only government puppets. I don't know how to call them differently. They are like national fronts, patriotic fronts, and parties like that, and they are acting as opposition, speaking, you know, against the ruling party, but they are actually their puppets, and they are only acting as opposition. So also there are a few right-wing parties who are maybe the real opposition, but they are really fascist parties, and they are very, very dangerous. So what I also observed when I mentioned earlier influence from Russia. 2 years ago, when the war started, actually, after that, we have on the streets of Belgrade, for the first time after 10 years, we have one right-wing organization which was banned, actually, because of the homophobic attacks, and they were banned, I don't know, 10 years ago maybe. Its name is Obraz. And alongside with them, there were Wagner Group, which is also a right-wing organization from Russia, and they were operating on Belgrade Street. I didn't know at that time, but I recently realized that I read it actually in one independent media that some Russian activists who are progressive, not right-wingers, they were opposing those right-wingers from Wagner and from Serbia, and they were beaten severely on the streets. And after that, they went to Germany, and the process on our courts are very slow, and that process is happening now, and that activist wanted to came here again to Serbia to, testify about that he was beaten, and at our borders he was held, and they didn't allow him to be here and testify and to enter the Serbia, actually. So I didn't know at that time. I only heard this last week, actually. And when you read this, you cannot, neglect that influence from Russia and their how it is important for our anti-gender actors, and for, of course, Serbian Orthodox Church is also connected with the Russian Orthodox Church, and I think that because of that the money is from Russia.
Okay. Muchas gracias, Alex. Bueno, gracias. Vamos a esta última ronda muy corta porque quisiera que tuviéramos tiempo para preguntarnos, para escuchar a las demás. Entonces, les quisiera pedir que habláramos una acción muy concreta, muy brevemente, 3 minutos, para que podamos participar sobre qué tenemos que hacer frente a este contexto que ustedes nos han planteado, que esta mañana construimos colectivamente, qué tenemos que hacer. Entonces, 3 minutos cada uno, para que podamos dar el paso a la conversación.
Bueno, no hay respuesta. Voy a citar Joan Scott en un texto clásico sobre género hace 30 años. No hay respuestas fáciles para preguntas difíciles, y no imagino que ustedes tengan la expectativa que nosotros seremos capaces de responder a eso, ¿no? Yo no tengo respuesta, pero caminos posibles, y son 3. El primer es reconocer que, como se ha visto en esa conversación, las fuerzas antigénero conectadas con las fuerzas de ultraderecha son completamente interseccionales. Completamente. Superan sus conflictos. Como ha dicho Alex, la Iglesia Ortodoxa Serbia está absorbiendo cosas de la Iglesia Católica Croacia con quien tenía conflictos. En América Latina, los católicos y evangélicos que peleaban están juntos. Son muchos los ejemplos. Pero eso significa que no hay cómo responder a eso sin tener una política interseccional. Y una política interseccional amplia, ¿no? Y acá tenemos un reto enorme, porque las fuerzas con las cuales estamos nos defrontando son muy, muy poderosas. Y no va a ser posible contenerlas solamente con las capacidades y poderes que tenemos en el campo de derechos humanos, género y sexualidad y feminista. Y eso estoy hablando desde la experiencia de Brasil, ¿no? No hubiéramos sido capaces de derrotar electoralmente a Bolsonaro, nosotros de ese campo. Y eso implica que esas alianzas tienen que se hacer con muchos otros afuera de nuestras fronteras. Y es más fácil decirlo que hacerlo, porque hay tensiones, problemas, dificultades. O sea, eso para mí es como un reto gigantesco que mal empezamos a hablar sobre. Pienso mucho, estoy mirando a Sandra porque no está, se fue. por Argentina en ese momento, ¿no? Que van a ser las feministas argentinas frente al Congreso en ese momento con la amenaza sobre aborto y otras cosas, o sea, como un ejemplo. Y finalmente, siendo que uno de los instrumentos, de las armas usadas por esas fuerzas es el fantasma del género, como ha escrito Butler en su nuevo libro, también es crucial que enfrentemos ese espectro de modo conceptual y político, ¿no? Y como dice la misma Butler en una entrevista que va a ser publicada en Brasil, debemos analizar qué produjo el fantasma, pero solo un ejercicio de contraimaginación va a poder disiparlo. Y tenemos que entender mejor los miedos del fantasma que hace con que las personas normales, electores, caminen en esa dirección. It's very simple, isn't it? Just that. Huh?
I think mine might be simple, and obviously it's a suggestion. It's not, there's too many. One thing that's clear from what Alex was saying, what Sonia was saying, is that so much of the impact that we're feeling comes from the normalization of violence, violent language, violent behavior. And I think that's where we need to be pushing back. And I think again, this is just one suggestion, is through the media. So one of the things we haven't spoken about is what the media that we're losing and the media spaces that the anti-gender, anti-rights is occupying. Again, forgive for the US example, but we have what's called legacy media. So New York Times, the Washington Post, and these, were reliably spaces for unbiased reporting. They're losing staff, but there's also we're also losing local media, and I think that's a place where I would, really encourage us to replace that vacuum and build more progressive journalists. We talk a lot in this movement about narratives. I think we have the narratives. I think we're good. What I don't think we have is access to the speakers, like the radio, the internet, social media. And so again, that would be my one very brief is like, let's fill that vacuum by having spokespeople, building the capacity of feminist journalists to do investigative reporting. Just to give one quick example, there was the State of the Union address the other night where Biden spoke, does that once a year. And then the Republicans, the opposition party, has an opportunity to respond. And the woman who responded, she told this, again, to talk about, normalizing violence, this story about sex trafficking. And then she referred to this woman, and it was all lies. And the person who uncovered that was not the Washington Post, but it was a local reporter who looked into the case that she was referencing and found that, in fact, she misstated and lied about many facts. And then the victim who was trafficked, she came out today and said, actually, none of that is true. So all of which is to say we can push back if we have investigative reporters who have a feminist lens and who are sensitive to our issues would be just one suggestion. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, that's my challenge.
Maybe it's empty battery. Okay. Thank you. I forgot to mention earlier, our media, we have really a few independent media, so it's very hard for us to reach the media, actually, to send our message. And of course, journalists who are not just objective, who are supportive of women's rights or LGBT rights, they are also under threat from right-wingers and from the government. They are constantly in danger. Some of their lives are in danger in Serbia. So what are we doing to resist all those narratives? We are building alliances. We are connecting. And 3 years ago, we made that trans feminist network. It covers all the ex-Yugoslav countries, and we have like around 100 people who are active in conversations. We have a Discord server with I don't know, 15 channels about different topics, about, for example, anti-gender in Croatia, anti-gender in Bosnia, anti-gender in Serbia. We started with only one channel, anti-gender, like media and news, and then we realized that we need to, you know, compartmentalize it to, for Serbia, for every country, one channel, and we have a lot of channels there where we discuss other topics, important feminist, trans-feminist topics. So, and the last year we have a first live gathering that gather like around 25 to 30 people in Montenegro, and we are planning to have one more gathering of trans-feminist platform this year. We are also decided to produce knowledge to explain to people who are not sure what to think. And we are also we have a trans feminist magazine, 2 issues per year. Now we are preparing 5th issue, and the topics are, for example, a topic for a last issue was solidarity. We are talking about solidarity. This is one of the topics that we discussed in our platform on Discord, when we discussed how to, you know, approach to anti-trans actors. Or persons or organizations. We are not like opposing them, like we don't want to talk with you at all. We are trying to communicate with them. We are trying to approach them. And 2 years ago, one very famous feminist and anti-war group, Women in Black, you maybe heard of them, we heard that they are promoting some anti-trans narratives, and then we asked them to join them on their conference and to hear what they have to say about this issue. And I must say that for 3 hours, some speakers spoke really transphobic comments, and everything was really hard to listen. And there were 6 trans activists, and we had at the end like 20 minutes for to respond to that. And I must say that the public, the people who were present as the public there, we bought them in 20 minutes only, with our stories, with our, you know, side of story. And they realize actually that what they were speaking for 3 hours is just nonsense and not feminist values, and it was actually great success. And now Women in Black are our allies. And we are trying to do, and at every panel, when I speak here in Belgrade, we always have 2 or 3 persons who are, you know, from anti-trans movement, and they're trying to intimidate me and my colleagues, but we are very calm, and we are we try to reason them and to explain to them that they are not right. And the other people see that, and then I don't know, that's our win every time. So, and I hope that some of them also will realize that they are on the wrong side of this fight. So this is our tactics, and we are producing knowledge and making alliances. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Vamos a dar paso a unas 3 intervenciones por el tiempo que tenemos, 3 o 4. Preguntas, comentarios que ustedes quieran hacer, y luego hacemos el cierre con una intervención corta de nuevo de cada uno de ustedes. Entonces, por acá.
Hola, gracias. Sonia, yo tenía una consulta replanteando lo que estábamos hablando en mesa, ¿no? Mi nombre es Miluska Lusquiños, de Transorganización Feminista de Perú. Nosotras nos habíamos planteado como estrategia frente al avance de los grupos antigénero en Perú, replantear las narrativas, ¿no? Pero ¿cómo podríamos replantear esas narrativas con enfoque de género y que promuevan leyes de identidad de género, por ejemplo? Porque sabemos que la contraparte, la otra parte, que son los grupos antigénero en Perú, el movimiento Con Mis Hijos No Te Metas, la Resistencia, Fujimori, el Congreso, tiene estrategias fuertes y mucho dinero para escribir también narrativas en contra de las nuestras. ¿Qué perspectiva deberían tener esas narrativas desde tu punto de vista? Eso.
Thank you for the interesting interventions. I wanted to ask you about your Yes, I'm Lara from Women's Fund Armenia. I wanted to ask you about all these issues that you were mentioning, the anti-gender, anti-racism, and all this related to the digital world we have, because the digital world is also owned by these bad people you were talking about. And now thinking about artificial intelligence and how it's going to change our mindset and realities where we cannot believe anything that is shown to us, and also how much this digital world is helping in normalizing the violence you were talking about and desensitizing us about what's happening. And since we are living in a reality and mostly in societies where less and less people are reading the Washington Post or the New York Times and all these journalistic analytical thing. Mostly they're on TikTok and Instagram and listening to what people like them and talking the same language like them is thinking about the issues, is thinking about election, is thinking about violence or women's rights or trans rights, etc. Can we tackle this issue at the same time? Is the development of AI is going to help us in this way, or it's going to be another thing that we need to think and worry about and lose hope on? Can you tell us your perspective a little bit, how in the digital and virtual world this can be either surpassed or another thing that we need to have in mind while tackling these issues? Thank you.
¿Alguien más tiene una pregunta, comentario?
My name's Rebecca, and I'm from Australia. Sonia, you said that 30 years ago we didn't decide to define what is a woman, and that's something that still troubles. And I would suggest that we're coming to the end of the utility. I would suggest that we're coming to the end of the utility of identity politics, partially because the far right has adopted it and transformed it for their own uses. And I'm wondering what you see as the next evolution of organizing. If we're no longer organizing ourselves along by identities, is there a more useful and effective way to be organizing ourselves?
Hi, I'm Rimi Abi Faraj, and I work with the Equality Fund. Yeah, is this better? So I wanted to ask, you each touched on it a bit, but I'm wondering what you think about the actual role and impact that the so-called progressives, being white feminists, or now as we call Western feminist role. I think the example of UN Women was really key. With everything happening, for example, in the Middle East and North Africa now, feminists went on strike on March 8th, and there were massive protests in front of UN Women in Beirut that were subjected to massive violence and attacks. And I'm just wondering if this is a focus that we're not focusing on actually as a movement in terms of the impact and implication and the complicity, which I think we're seeing a lot with the genocide in Gaza now and the hypocrisy around sexual violence and how sexual violence is actually being co-opted as a way to justify further further violence and genocide, but also the pinkwashing and the use of LGBTQI plus rights. Knowing that, I think at least you see the Western feminists often using, especially in Turtle Islands with the United States and Canada, staying silent actually in the current moment. And if there's a shift that you see, or are we actually kind of underplaying this group's impact? Because we talk a lot about the right, but we're not talking a lot about the so-called progressives and Western feminists and their role within what's happening now. And I think, at least for me, I think it's starting now within the Middle East, but we know the ripple effect of how the anti-rights movement has been and how you're saying. But I think this is also a new way of co-opting that I find very dangerous, that I think maybe I would love to hear what you think those implications, if at all, and how we can really counter that.
Ok, muchas gracias por los comentarios y las preguntas. Habían varias para Sonia, pero nos gustaría entonces como volver a tener cada una la palabra, si se quieren referir a algunos de los comentarios en particular o completar alguna de las ideas que nos presentaron, y de nuevo tendríamos alrededor de unos 3-4 minutos para poder cerrar el panel.
Bueno, yo voy a responder a Miluska a la pregunta, hablar algunas cosas sobre el tema de la política digital y un poco reaccionar a lo que dices. No respondiendo, pero creo que añadiendo, ¿no? Miluska, yo pienso que, como decía Gillian, no tenemos tantos problemas de narrativa. Somos capaces de construir narrativas y muy eficaces. Lo que no hemos sido capaces es tan capaces de transmitir esas narrativas y de definir mejor nuestras audiencias, ¿no? ¿Con quién queremos hablar? ¿Queremos hablar con las sociedades? ¿No? ¿Queremos nosotros capturar corazones y mentes para esas agendas? ¿O queremos hablar con los actores estatales, ¿no? Hablando desde el punto de vista de América Latina, donde los procesos de democratización nos han puesto mucho en relación directa con los estados, los sistemas, las cortes constitucionales, los congresos, hay como un bias, un bias, ¿no? Una tendencia que cuando hablamos de narrativa estamos como un poco siempre hablando con los actores estatales, instituciones. Eso en ese momento se tiene que romper. No, tenemos que volver a hablar con la sociedad, con las personas, cómo está haciendo la derecha, ¿no? Hay que disputar la narrativa ahí, ¿no? No tanto también en las instituciones, pero ahí. Con relación, muchas gracias por la pregunta sobre la revolución digital, la digitalización de la política y de la vida, porque primero yo creo que esa es una contingencia de nuestros tiempos, ¿no? No hay cómo escapar de eso, ¿no? ¿Qué vas a hacer? Eso es una condición determinante en nuestros tiempos. La segunda es que no he dicho y debería haber dicho, la digitalización de la política y la habilidad de la ultraderecha de incorporar esa tecnología en sus estrategias y modos de accionar político es un elemento crucial para explicar cómo han crecido tan rápida. Venían en reorganización desde los 70, pero ha sido en los 90, con la digitalización de la política, que han cambiado de escala y han amplificado sus conexiones transnacionales. Entonces, como la política digital es como un factor, ¿no?, de crecimiento de la derecha, por otro lado, los progresistas no han sido tan capaces de hacerlo. La escena en Brasil es patética, miro las brasileñas, porque la capacidad del bolsonarismo de utilizar la política digital es gigantesca, mientras que la capacidad de las izquierdas de hacerlo es casi nada. Entonces, es como una cosa. Y en ese campo tenemos el problema, casi hablando de las élites económicas que apoyan las políticas de derecha, tenemos un señor, ¿no?, que es el dueño de Twitter, de X, que es un aliado abierto de todas las fuerzas de derecha del mundo, que es Elon Musk, ¿no? O sea, ese personaje no podemos dejar de mencionarlo y de nombrarlo cuando hablamos de esos temas, ¿no? Y bueno, no voy a responder tu pregunta, pero quiero decirte que lamentablemente desde 7 de octubre y sobre todo cuando empezaron a salir los discursos, ¿no?, en las noticias sobre la violación, Hamas y las violaciones y las imágenes, yo he gastado un tiempo precioso de mi vida a hablar con feministas de Latinoamérica que por favor no circulasen esos mensajes, ¿no? Porque no es solo en Estados Unidos. O sea, la capacidad, el apelo que tiene el tema de la violencia sexual y de la violación cruza fronteras, y un montón de feministas latinas súper comprometidas, no son pro-sionistas, no son pro-Israel, pero estaban circulando información producida deliberadamente por la máquina de propaganda de Israel, ¿no? Y yo he tenido, así como he tenido peleas con grupos LGBT progresistas de Brasil que estaban circulando esos mensajes horribles de pinkwashing en Brasil. Creamos un perfil en Instagram en Brasil para manejar eso. Entonces, solo para decir que es un súper problema, pero que no está ubicado solo, digamos, en el west, en el norte, ¿no? Es mucho más diseminado.
Sí, respondiste. Well, so since you answered the digital question, I'm very grateful that you brought up that question because I think it's critical to address right now. And just to step back, I think, the people who are making the criticisms, it's both our side and then the opposition, the criticism of, of the feminist movement not being sufficiently outspoken about what happened on October 7th. But I think one thing we need to interrogate from the critiques that come from the right is why are they making them? They don't give a shit about women. What is interesting is that when the criticisms, and forgive me if I don't know if people are following this closely, but after October 7th, there were these very big attacks against UN Women. Again, not the greatest entity, but the right wing was going after UN Women saying, hey, why aren't you speaking out? And what was interesting is that when you were tracking where the criticism coming from, some of it, as you said, was from the Israeli government, but other was from this Geneva-based NGO called UN Watch, whose sole focus is to, like we mentioned earlier, to really eviscerate multilateralism, right? So in general, the UN has been progressive-ish on Palestinian issues and not on Israel. So you have these entities, these NGOs that are being set up that are using what happened on October 7th to go after the UN. So I think that's another interesting piece to interrogate and see where they're coming from, because they're clearly not committed to the issue. So I don't know, that would be my consideration. And to, white feminists, it's a problem, and there were statements that have come out. It's very politically fraught because so many organizations right now are being defunded who speak out, so there's both a financial and political risk, but again, there's also an imperative because things are so dire, and to not speak out is, well, unforgivable. But anyway, so I don't know if that responds to it, but that's certainly things that have been percolating in the conversations in the US and other places.
Okay, I will say only a few words on all of these questions. I have some, a lot of text in my mind now about identities. I don't know, in postmodernism it seemed that we will leave our identities and live in some different society, but I don't know. I think that we need to stick to our values rather than identities per se, like identities. We are actually, I changed my identity through life, only gender identity, I think maybe 5 times. So what's the identity? My values are more important to me and values of other person than their identity. And we can see this in all those stories and war stories and genocide and everything, that values and empathy is something that we should value and gather around, not just around identities. And about new era with media and with everything, I must point out that I actually noticed, I work with a lot of young people in a community, and I'm realizing that we need to think about changing in our activist politics and how we do activism, because I'm 43 years old and I work with people who are in their 20s. They are so different than me. They are so different, and I think that we cannot impose on them our strategies like older people than me do to me, push me in the fire. I am not sure. I think that actually, I'm sure we shouldn't do that to younger people, and times are different. People are more into social media. We need to focus on that. and we need to focus on that, how they are thinking, how they are working, what they actually need, and how they can the best use their potential in activism. Because I'm realizing here in Serbia that if we are trying to continue with the old model of activism, we are doomed, especially in that anti-trans rights. I realizing this, we were part of organizing, part of independent network who are organizing protest March of 8, and this year we have less people there, less organizers, because people are exhausted, women are exhausted because of the elections happened in December and everything, protests in Belgrade, all the violence. The government are trying to exhaust us and every step that we make, and I think that we need to change our strategies. I don't know, this is my 2 cents.
Bueno, creo que con esta intervención cerramos nuestro panel. Ya aquí Andrea y Yelena me están mirando extrañamente. Entonces, queremos agradecer muy del corazón a Sonia, a Gillian, a Alex por su presentación, por sus aportes también a esta discusión y a que podamos avanzar en este camino correcto, también recibiendo un poco toda esta información y este análisis que nos han compartido en este panel. Y muchas gracias a todas y a todos por su atención y también por participar en este espacio.
Gracias Diana. Súper.